Please pray with me. More of you, O Christ, less of me. More of you, O Christ, less of me. More of you, O Christ, less of me. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts draw us closer to you, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. When I was 13 years old, which is the time when most children in Reformed sorts of congregations do some kind of confirmation process in order to become members of the church, my parents had figured out that if we didn't leave the little town of Perryton, Texas, I would probably never get into the sort of university that I could if we lived in a bigger town with a better school system. And especially because I was a musician, more music teachers. I'd outgrown the two in Perryton. And so we were planning to move to Midland, Texas, which is a town of more like 20,000, and I went from a town where my graduating class would have been 42 to a city where my graduating class was 560. Big change. But what hadn't really changed is that I was very deeply committed to the little Presbyterian church I had been raised in. And the pastor of that church, John Odie, had been really important to me. And I really wanted to join that little church before we moved to Midland so that with my parents, we could all join a new church together as members by reason of transfer, and I wouldn't have to go through some kind of confirmation class when I was too old. And so my mother, who was at the time on the session of that church, she was an early elder. The head of the session at the time was a woman called Catherine Allen. And she was the widow of the first judge in Ochiltree County. And she was a formidable presence. I cannot even begin to tell you what Catherine Allen was like in person. I know all of her grandchildren, her great-grandchildren, and now I've met a few of her great-great-grandchildren, but trust me, she was the matriarch of all matriarchs. So my mother went to her and proposed this plan, and Catherine said, well, I think that the session could examine her to see if she has a good enough knowledge of the faith and order of the Presbyterian Church to become a member. And my mother thought, oh my. But it was set, and my mother was not allowed to attend. My father was not allowed to attend. There I was with the pastor, Catherine Allen, and some other people I don't remember. And Catherine Allen proceeded to grill me for 2 hours. She asked me things they didn't ask me in my ordination process. But apparently, she decided that my answers were satisfactory for a 13-year-old, and so my examination was passed and I was allowed to join the church. Now I say this because I want to tell one other story about Catherine Allen, and if you don't understand this other story, you don't really get why this is so amazing. So in the period of time my mother served on the session with Catherine Allen, they reached a point in the year where, you know, small church, time to get some new leaders, and there was a woman who'd been in the church for 20 years, was another teacher like my mother, And they went through this list of who'd ever been an elder before, and she said, you know, why hasn't she ever been an elder before? She'd make a great elder. And Catherine Allen looked at my mother and said, she has lived in Perryton, Texas for 20 years and never planted a single tree. I, at 13, had not planted a tree either, but I guess maybe she'd heard I liked trees. And it's fascinating because I remember at the time thinking, yes, in this place of very few trees, trees are very, very precious. Very precious. And people took great care to plant trees and keep them alive through the panhandle winds and through the horrible snows and the hot summers and all the things that happened. And trees were a sign of life. To those early pioneers crossing the great savanna that was the Great Plains, in the distance they could see the giant cottonwoods. And when they saw giant cottonwoods, they knew there was water and they might live. If they could just get to those trees. The song, The Willow Maid, is a new version of, there's many, many old stories about various beautiful women trapped in the forest that men try to, quote, rescue, and it never works out. Example A, Rusalka and her song to the moon. So many stories like this. And there is this sense that things that happen in the forest, in the trees, reach down to the deepest of the sacred. On Facebook, amongst other things, I follow Sir David Attenborough's page because I'm sure it's his staff, but they post the most wonderful photos with little tidbits from all over the world about nature and the things that he has done over the years. And yesterday, there was a picture of an olive tree that is believed to be at least 5,000 years old. Now, let your mind wrap around that a little bit. 5,000 years ago. 5,000 years ago, Homer was writing the Iliad. 5,000 years ago, some of the oldest parts of the Bible, Isaiah, Daniel, some of these other parts were being perhaps written. The tree was 3,000 years old when Jesus walked the earth. This tree, which is actually not considered the oldest tree on earth, there's an oak that's considered older, but this tree is very healthy and still produces olives after 5,000 years. Now, it's 26 feet in diameter, which is very big, although not compared to some of our sequoias. We know that some of our trees are the largest trees on earth, if not the oldest, because even though redwood trees are old, they're not nearly as old as some of these olives and oaks. And it seemed appropriate today, too, to talk about trees because indigenous people, I think a little bit like Catherine Allen, one of the great horrors that is recorded and told in many, many indigenous stories is that when Europeans came, they felled all the trees. They destroyed the trees, and they couldn't understand how they expected to live having done that. They found natural clearings and lived with the trees, letting the trees give them shade as opposed to turning trees into lumber and building buildings. Think about that. Just think about that. Now, we can argue they didn't know any better, but somehow they had lost their ancient wisdom because certainly the Celts knew that trees were sacred, but somehow by the time they became imperialists and colonists, they'd forgotten their connection to the natural world. They'd forgotten that trees are not simply commodities to be used up, but rather they are absolutely essential to our survival. Now think about it. Right now, we're breathing. Carbon dioxide goes out, oxygen comes in. I'll bet most of you know this, but haven't really thought about, where does the oxygen come from? It primarily comes from broadleaf trees. Other plants do produce some oxygen, but broadleaf trees are the only reason we can breathe. Without them, we're dead. We're just dead. So if you look at these various images on the bulletin, the one of a lung and a tree branch, we cannot live without them. And I know I'm preaching to the choir. I know everybody here likes trees, thinks trees are cool, has an okay relationship with trees. You certainly wouldn't want to clear cut them. But let's go a little bit deeper. Let's go a little bit deeper and imagine for a minute what life would be like without them. Now, I can actually imagine this quite well, having grown up in the Panhandle. You drove 10 miles out of town and you could get to where you could not see any trees. None. Zero. Now, that meant that we had really good views of the stars, but it also meant there was absolutely no shade, and there was very little water, and it was a hard, hard place to live. So my ancestors, with no trees to cut down and create their houses, and no trees even to camp under, dug holes in the ground and lived in dugouts. They literally had to build themselves caves because there was no other way. Now, in retrospect, maybe that was a good thing. Maybe more of us should live underground rather than taking down the trees to build our homes. If we let ourselves recognize how important trees are, we all should recognize how vulnerable they are, how unbelievably vulnerable they can be. And it's not like there isn't ancient wisdom that didn't tell us this. When I did my big search of the Bible looking for references to trees, which, by the way, there are a lot of trees in the Bible, from the Garden of Eden all the way to Revelation. But one curious passage I found in Deuteronomy was the instruction that when you kill your enemies, totally fine to do that, kill them however you will, but do not harm their trees. Because somehow or another, ancient Israel knew, also living in a desert where trees are very, very precious, that if you kill their trees, you're killing a part of yourself. So I think about how war has never considered the trees. Napalm all over Vietnam. And yes, it killed soldiers, and I am compassionate about that, but it killed a whole lot of trees too, in a jungle. And that made it very difficult for anyone to live there for a very long time. I think about the cedars of Lebanon. How many of those have they hit by accident in this current war? The famous cedars of Lebanon. All over the Middle East, there are some ancient trees that have been protected by miracle. And we have some in this country as well. During the retreat, I learned about the emancipation oak. Have you ever seen the emancipation oak? Well, it's in Virginia. I was hoping, Joyce, maybe you'd seen it. It was a tree where slaves used to gather. And it was a place where it is said, and I tend to believe this oral history, that under this great oak tree, the first time a slave could read, they gathered as many ex-slaves as they could and read the Emancipation Proclamation under that tree. And it's now known as the Emancipation Oak. In Austin, where I've spent a lot of time, there's a very famous tree called the treaty oak. And one of the things I learned in my study this time was some things I didn't know. I knew the more recent history of the treaty oak, but I didn't know that before Europeans came to Texas, and that includes the Spaniards who came in the 1500s, before even the Spaniards came, the Comanche and the Tonkawa would go beneath that tree that is now the treaty oak, and apparently there were 13 what they called council oaks. And this grove of 13 gigantic oak trees was where they made peace between the tribes. They didn't call it treaty, but later, when the Europeans came, they kept the tradition. And yet, by the 20th century, only one of the 13 was left. And it was in private hands, a family named Caldwell. And they didn't want responsibility for this tree, and they really did want the legislature to buy it. And they told the Texas legislature, we'll sell it to you for $7,000. And the Texas legislature, being as skin-flinted now as they were then, said, no, thank you. So the city of Austin, which was barely a city and hardly knew what they were doing, showed a little bit of their same kind of thinking then as they have now. And they raised $1,000 with the help of O. Henry, by the way, who lived there at the time. And they bought the property, 1 acre and this tree. And they set up a park. It's still known as Treaty Oak Park. Now, some of you may know that in 1989, a very disturbed young man poisoned the treaty oak. He put enough poison on that tree to kill 100 trees. Arborists were flown in from all over the world to try to save the treaty oak. They created what they can only be described as sort of dialysis. They tried to get all of the fluids in the tree moving so they could get the poison out. And in the end, even though every arborist said there's no way this tree will survive, it lives. It still lives. It's a little lopsided. Half of it died off. And it's now behind so much fencing that you can no longer sit beneath its shady boughs. But at the point at which they thought the treaty oak might die, the Daughters of the Republic of Texas, and this is yet another of my mother's stories because she was on the board at the time, decided that they wanted to preserve some essence of the treaty oak. And so they created enough seedlings to send a good seedling to every county in Texas with the request that they plant it on their courthouse lawn. And there are still hundreds of pieces of the treaty oak now growing all over Texas. And the treaty oak still stands. During the retreat, I learned that in Sonoma, there's a tree called the valley oak. The valley oak is what's known as a sentinel oak. They don't know how old it is, but probably hundreds of years old. And according to the naturalists at the Laguna, which is a nature preserve in Sebastopol, this one tree in a field by itself supports 500 species. 500 species, one tree. Now we're on that list. So are some species that we might not care about in the bug and fungus categories, but so many animals and so many other creatures. It's not just a keystone species, it is the center of that ecosystem. You cut a tree down like that, you might get a small cottage out of it, maybe more, since it's oak. You might make a beautiful dining room table. You might make church pews. You might make a case for a piano. Look, there's wood everywhere in this room. Look at the ceiling. Look at the wood. Now, I'm not saying that we have to give up lumber and paper and all the beautiful things that come from trees. But when it comes to some of these mother trees, these old trees, maybe we need to stop and take a moment and remember. So I also found this text from Daniel, and I don't read Daniel hardly ever. It's kind of a feverish dream of a prophet who is often misused by other people in the Christian family. But this amazing vision is maybe closer to the truth than not. Upon my bed, this is what I saw. There was a tree at the center of the earth, and its height was great, and the tree grew great and strong. Its top reached to heaven, and it was visible to the ends of the whole earth. Its foliage was beautiful, its fruit abundant, and it provided food for all. The animals of the field found shade under it. The birds of the air nested in its branches, and from it all living beings were fed. When I looked towards the commentaries to kind of understand this passage a little bit, many of the scholars said Daniel was thinking this was his image of Isaiah's peaceable kingdom, the holy mountain where there will be peace. An image of peace that seems really tangible because trees are part of our life. Trees are part of our life. And so it's a tangible image of what it would mean to make peace. We don't have to try to get lions and lambs to get along, but we could take Deuteronomy's advice and say, kill who you want. Maybe human beings are sort of disposable, but don't harm the trees. Because in that instruction, you have to recognize what the collateral damage of our violence and hubris is. It all comes back to hurt ourselves. So even those people who would like to argue a philosophy of selfishness, it's not in your best interest to be a war maker, to be a tree killer, even if it's by accident. It's just not in our interest to do it. Indigenous people know that if you destroy the earth, you destroy yourselves. And we're still trying to learn that lesson. We're still trying to learn that lesson. So my invitation to you this week is to strike up a new relationship with a tree that you can see now. Even if it's just one you can see from your window, even if it's one that takes a bit of a hike, even if it's a scrawny one, see what you can learn. And at the very least, especially to those broadleaf trees, go up to one, take a deep breath, and say thank you. Thanks for the oxygen. Thanks for all the gifts to the squirrels who are acorn insane right now.
Ten horse. Hello. And we want to talk and see 10 horse.
Or go see a tree. This is a longer sermon than usual, but I had more material than usual. And I invite you to simply reconnect with the sacred trees in your life, with gratitude and love, with hopefulness, and with prayers for peace. Because in Revelation, it says that there was a tree in the middle of the holy city, and the leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nations. May it be so. Amen.